Welcome back to lesson 2 of the study of the life of Christ, coming to you from a different location. We're going to be recording the lessons that we do not cover on Wednesday evenings in this separate setting. That way we can have a complete study of the life of Christ. Hope you enjoy this different setting. Do apologize up front. We do not have the capability at this current time to run our customary PowerPoint slides in conjunction with these first few lessons, but Lord willing, in due time, we will have that ability up and running. So encourage everyone to let us know if you want to receive the outlines emailed to you. Just email that request to info@ccocwv.org. Again, that is info@ccocwv.org. And we will email you the electronic PDF, the electronic version of our outlines. That way you can have them to follow along. And if you would also like to get a copy of the Truth for Today commentary, which is the basis of this study, and the Truth for Today commentary and Truth for the World Mission School is the one responsible for producing this material for the life of Christ, study of the life of Christ. If you would like to get that commentary, also include that in your email to us, and we can help to attain that book and get it to you. So we look forward to this study and continuing it and getting the, if you will, off lessons that we are not doing on Wednesday evenings and filling in the blanks. That way it's a complete, well-rounded study of the life of Christ. When we look at the life of Christ, again, we're moving into lesson 2 here. We're going to be looking at the world of Jesus' day and the political landscape that was taking place at that time. When we take a look back at the Old Testament, we see that we come down to the end of the period of those 39 books. And when we come down to the completion of those 39 books, we begin to realize Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. But also Malachi was the last Old Testament prophetic book to be written. But before that, we have Nehemiah, and Nehemiah wrote the last Old Testament historical book that was written for the Old Testament. So we have 2 books leading up here in the minor prophets that are very unique. You have Nehemiah writing the last historical record, and Malachi writing the last prophetic record. And then we see that Malachi comes up and he completes the Old Testament. And now when we get to this, that we see that according to secular history, it's proposed that the last Old Testament scriptures were written around 430 to 425 BC, which gives a very good indicator. It's a very good indicator that 400-year intertestamental period that we see between Malachi and Matthew, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, coincides. Because what do we see? The first New Testament event that occurred, when we look back, it occurred in about 5 BC, and that was the birth of John the Baptist. So again, that gives us that's an indicator that we have just a little over 400 years from the Old Testament to New Testament. But we're not left with it wasn't a cliffhanger where we were left in Malachi with this, what's the rest of the story going to be? Malachi wrote in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. Listen to what Malachi writes. And remember, he's being inspired by the Lord to write this. So Malachi, writing for the Lord, says, "Behold, I send my messenger. He will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." That's Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. So when we think about this, he was giving a prophecy saying, I send my messenger and he will prepare the way before me. As we're going to see in the lessons as we move forward, is going to be phenomenal in how he did that. And how John the Baptist helped to lay the groundwork for Christ to be here on the earth in the form of a man. Now think about this. FBS Dean observed that the, quote, natural scenery is the same as when Abraham first pitched his tent at Shechem. But all else is changed. Why was there so much time before the sending of God's Son? FBS, but let's move back here for just a second. Natural scenery. The natural scenery was the same. Why was that? Why was it the same? Why would he even allude to it being the same as when Abraham? Why would we even come back to Abraham being mentioned here? Well, it's important because everything that happened from the Old Testament into the New is crucial. It laid the way for what was happening. It was everything that happened before Christ came was a foreshadowing. It was laying the foundation. It was laying the groundwork for what was to happen when we look into the pages of the New Testament and we begin to see prophecy fulfilled. Natural scenery is the same as when Abraham first pitched his tent at Shechem, but all else changed. The political climate is changing. The religious climate is now changing. We're seeing a transition from the old law. There's now going to be it's transitioning now, and coming in the New Testament. John the Baptist coming on the scene to pave the way for Christ. We see that we're coming in, and into the New Testament, Christ is being born. Christ is going to be, we're going to see him born. We're going to see just not even a snippet out of his childhood. Then we're going to move in future lessons, seeing how he begins his ministry. So a lot changes. Now let's move into point 1 on the outline. And again, if you want these, give us an email and we will get them out to you. But why was there so much time before the sending of the Son by the Father? Well, think about this. A.F. LaGard Smith suggests there are 3 reasons. Now, as we go through this, keep in mind that these are not absolutes. These are just mere suggestions by mere men. But the first one that A.F. LaGard Smith suggests of why there was such a span of hundreds of years between the Old Testament being completed and the New Testament being written and the arrival of the Son of God. Number 1, God may have wanted to dramatize the event. Think about this. He may have wanted to be a dramatic entry. He wanted it to be He wanted to be memorable. He wanted it to be significant. He wanted it not in the aspect of being celebrated, but he wanted people to know that this child that has been born is my son. It may not have been immediate, but number 2, God may have wanted to make the fulfilled messianic prophecy more impressive, which ties in with him wanting to dramatize the event. Or number 3, God may have simply been waiting until the religious and political situation was exactly right for Jesus to arrive. Now think about what Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 4 in verse 4. And we'll read down through the end of verse 5. But he writes there in Galatians chapter 4, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." Now think about what he's saying here. When the fullness of time had come. That third one is the most important when we look at it. The religious and political situation had to be exactly right for the arrival of Jesus Christ. But incorporated into that, it may have been to make it more dramatic. The events that transpired from his birth till his arrest, crucifixion, raising from the dead, and ascension back to the Father on high. And to make the Messianic prophecy more impressive. To let people know that this is the Son of God. The fullness of time had come. There is a whole scope, if you will. There had to be a well-rounded picture. It had to be fulfilled in the way God had planned. So when we look at that, that's what we need to remember, is that God has a plan. He always has and he always will. So when we think about this and we start to look back and we look at this intertestamental period, there are sources of information that we use for this period of time. Now, one of those is the apocryphal writings. The apocryphal writings are the 14 books that are in some Bibles, but they're not part of the canon. The apocryphal writings are supplemental. They're not the writings that are used to comprise the 66 books that we know as our Holy Bible. They're not part of the 39 books of the Old Testament, nor are they part of the 27 that make the New. So we use these to fill in some of the gaps. This is secular history. These are secular documents, if you will, that are used to make the picture complete. Another is the writings of Josephus. He was a great historian who was born, around AD 37 and survived the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So when we take a look at the writings of Josephus, and I'm going to look down here at page 12 in the commentary, we take a look at this and we see that he had two important works: the Antiquities of the Jews, that is a history of his people from creation, and the Jewish Wars, an account of the Jews from 170 BC until the time that Josephus lived. So we read after it, and Josephus also wrote two works of lesser importance to us, Against Apion and Autobiography. Some of Josephus' quote facts have been questioned, but his writings remain a major source of information. He lived during the time of Christ. We would say in a secular sense, he's a very reliable source to look at and to realize that these are credible. He's not as credible as the inspired writers who were inspired by the Holy Spirit to make the record that we know as the Bible. But he is credible in the secular side of things. There are also miscellaneous Greek and Roman witnesses that are used that can help us to put these pieces together, if you will. It's like pieces in a puzzle. You have all these pieces, but sometimes you have these pieces around the fringe that you say, you know what, if I just had these couple more pieces, it would make this picture complete. So that's what we have. They have miscellaneous Greek and Roman witnesses that put their accounts into writing, and we still have those writings, and more that we will see more of those going into the future lessons. Then we have archaeological findings. We go back and have archaeologists who will study the physical settings and find things, and it will back it up for what it is. The scriptures give us many answers, but not all. And this is what we look at also, and this is our most reliable source, is the scriptures, because it's inspired. That is, God breathed for us to have as an accurate record of what took place in that time. Now, the author of this commentary, Dr. Coy Roper, has dealt with this period in his third commentary on the Minor Prophets. And we need to remember that we have that at our disposal for those who are taking a look at that. And that is the Truth for Today series. You can go to their website and look that up. It's the Minor Prophets of Zechariah and Malachi in the intertestamental period. And again, that is the Truth for Today commentary series. Thirdly, let's take a look at the political landscape at the time of Christ. The political framework was outlined in Daniel chapter 2. And when we look back at Daniel chapter 2, we see that Nebuchadnezzar was king, and that Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and he was trying to figure out what this dream was, and he needed an explanation. And Daniel comes to him, and he gives him a very vivid and a very accurate interpretation of this dream. So when we see this, the political framework is outlined in this, the image that he saw in his dream, and it's outlined in Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 33. So if you will, if you have your Bible and you want to turn there or make a note that Daniel chapter 2 talks about this. So listen to what Daniel records beginning in verse 31 of that chapter. He says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay." And again, that's Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 through 33. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that he, the ruler of Babylon, was the head of gold, but then he went on to say this. And just keep in mind, Nebuchadnezzar this is a dream he's had. And this is dropping down to verse 39 in chapter 2. Daniel goes on to tell him this. He says, "Another kingdom, inferior to you, shall rise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. There shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks it to pieces, shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these." So we take a look at we look at secular history. We know that there are four kingdoms. Those four kingdoms were as follows. We see that the first was the Babylonian Empire. We know that. He's already told him, "You're the head of gold." And working down that, and the second one, the next one down, is the Medo-Persian Empire. Then coming down to that third level is the Grecian Empire. And then moving on down, we see the Roman Empire. But it doesn't stop there. The most important part of the prophecy is found in Daniel chapter 2 in the 44th verse. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. Daniel records, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people." What kingdom is that? Well, that would be the New Testament church. That is the New Testament church. He says, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed." Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. We have to remember that. In order for him to be a king, there has to be a kingdom. In order for there to be a kingdom, there has to be a king. He would not be called King of Kings if there wasn't a kingdom for him to rule over. He is the ruler of his people. But let's come back to our lesson. We see at the end of the Old Testament, Babylon had fallen. The Medo-Persian Empire had been established. And that's what we're going to talk about now. The Medo-Persian Empire. It existed from approximately 539 to 333 BC. At the end of the Old Testament, Persia controlled the land of Canaan. They still allowed the Jews to be controlled by the high priest. Remember this. Medo-Persians are controlling Canaan, but they're still allowing the Jews to be controlled by their high priest. In this period here is when the Samaritans came along due to tensions between the Jews, the returning, and the mixed race inhabitants. And we can read about that over in 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 24 through 33. We have to remember, at the end of this period, the Medo-Persians are controlling from 539 to 333 BC. Again, think about this. The Samaritans come along due to the tensions that are arising between the Jews that were returning and the mixed race inhabitants. But point number 5 on our outline, the Grecian Empire, the Grecian period, moving on through time. The Grecian period, so the Medo-Persians ended at about 333 BC. 330 BC, the Grecian period takes over. The Grecians take over. They're in power from 333 to 165 BC. This period is also known as the Macedonian period because Alexander the Great was from Macedonia. Alexander the Great was in power from approximately 330. He was there from 333 to 323. And in 336, he assumed command of the Grecian army at just 23 years of age. So think about this. In 336, he assumes command of the Grecian army at 23 years old. And at approximately 26 years old, he takes over the entire Grecian Empire. He comes in, he's the Grecian, he becomes Alexander the Great. Well, this guy comes on the scene. And he's very swift with what he does. He conquers the world in just a few years. And because of that, Greek culture spread very rapidly. Greek culture is expanding very rapidly, and which leads us to see that the Greek language is what we go back to and fall to when we study the New Testament. Well, this is important to Christians to know to realize that Alexander the Great is the one who had the Grecian Empire. He's the one who took over. He conquered the world in a few years. It's important because, again, knowing why Greek became the universal language. The New Testament was written in Greek. We need to realize that the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. We know why, because they were the Hebrew people. They were the Jewish people. We come to the New Testament, we need to realize this is leading into this, during this 400-year intertestamental period of nothing being recorded. These events are taking place. He took control of Jerusalem in 333 BC. It was during this period that the scribes became a distinct class of people. A distinct class of people. So think about this. He took control of Jerusalem in 333. Now we see with this, during this period of his reign, that the scribes become this distinct class in society. But moving on through history and moving on through time, we move on up the timeline. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great's death, upon his death, his kingdom was divided into 4 territories: Greece, Asia, Egypt, and Syria. The 2 territories that matter to us for this study and matter to us now are Egypt and Syria. When we look at Egypt, Ptolemy took over in 323 BC. The Ptolemies from 323 to 198. Ptolemies were in control of Egypt from 323 to 198 BC. Sitting between Egypt and Syria was Palestine. Now think about this. And we don't have a map of the Middle East in front of us, but sitting between Egypt and Syria was Palestine. It was trapped between the struggles of these two world powers at this time. Mostly during this time, the Jews were under Egyptian control or under Ptolemy's rule. So think about this. They're stuck between the Egyptians and the Syrians. You have this area of Palestine here. Now they're under the rule. It was a peaceful time. Under their rule, it was peaceful. It was also during this time that Ptolemy II commissioned a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures for the Great Library of Alexandria. It was completed around 285 BC. Now think about this. Ptolemy II commissioned this Greek translation for the Library at Alexandria. It was called the Septuagint, which means 70. It was created by 70 Jewish scholars. The Septuagint is still in existence today. And many scholars still use the Septuagint to this day. But think about this. 70 Jewish scholars translated this from the Hebrew text to the Greek. And we come down here and we see finally, around 198 BC, Palestine came under Syrian domination. And that's what brings us down here. The Seleucids ruled, that is Syria. Syria had the Seleucids, and they are from 198 to 165 BC. They're of a significance because they divided Palestine into 5 provinces: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, and Trachonitis. The Syrian rule was the darkest in the history of Judaism. Think about this. If we think about what happened, Syrian rule was the darkest in the history of Judaism. The villain then was Antiochus IV. And we can read about that in Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 11. Think about this. Antiochus IV, he hated the Jews and he tried to make Greeks of them. He tried to force them to become Greeks. He despised these people. He closed the temple. He made circumcision illegal. And he promised death to anyone who practiced Judaism. God's people have always faced persecution. There's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon so wisely penned in his writings. Think about this. Antiochus IV. He offered a sow on the altar, poured the ashes into water, and then sprinkled the water throughout the temple to desecrate it. How tragic. Made the worship of the God of heaven absolutely illegal. Now we come down on in the timeline, down to 165 BC, and we see the period of dependence. Now, this existed for approximately 100 years, from about 165 to 63 BC. Now, during this time, we have to remember the Jews were motivated to stop the horrible things that were happening, and were led by a priest named Mattathias. He had 5 bold sons, one which was named Judas the Hammer. But when looking at this, he had 5 bold sons. Mattathias did. When we think about this, he had Judas the Hammer. But Judas Maccabees reconquered Jerusalem in 165 BC. Reconquered Jerusalem, bringing back Judaism, bringing back the worship of Jehovah God, bringing back righteousness, bringing back holiness. The temple was rededicated to God under Judas Maccabeus, who reconquered Jerusalem in 165 BC. The origin of the Feast of Dedication was established as we read about in John chapter 10, verse 22. War with Syria continued until 143 BC, and John Hyrcanus, he started his dynasty in approximately 135 BC. Now, this is when Jewish sects arose, including the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Keep in mind the time frame we're talking about. So we see here, 135 BC, this dynasty started. This is when the Pharisees and Sadducees are starting to come on the rise, come on the scene. The high priest office now becomes more political. They're appointed by whomever was in power. It wasn't the high priest according to what God has said. It's now high priest due to, I like you, and this is who you're going to be a high priest for political reasons. We see a beginning of a digression away from God. At the end of this era were the times of civil strife, and when we see this again, you take God out of the picture in religion, in society, in culture, in government, and you begin putting the wants and the desires of man back in over top of what God has said. You're going to see civil strife. You're going to see a nation begin to crumble. You're going to see governments begin to crumble. You're going to see the religious institution begin to disintegrate. And also at this time, descendants of John Hyrcanus were plotting for the throne. And believe it or not, one of these descendants had actually invited Rome in to support them. A lot of things are beginning to, if you're a good Bible student, the light bulbs are beginning to come on, and the things are beginning to line up, seeing how all this is transpiring. It was not long before the Jews lost their independence once again. They lose their independence. In about 63 BC, we see the Roman period begin. The Jews were conquered by Pompey the Great in 63 BC. Palestine was put under a rulers responsible to Rome. Wait a second, what was that again? Palestine was put under rulers responsible and amenable back to Rome. Many of these we will read about in the gospel accounts. Think about this. The Romans gave the Jews many concessions. Great significance to Christians is how the Roman Empire prepared the way for Christ. Examples of these are, and concluding this particular lesson, we're going to see that the examples of these are universal language coming on the scene. Again, you look back, Alexander the Great helped pave the way. He conquered many, he took over that whole part of the world. He gives us a universal language, Greek. We see the Pax Romana, that is Roman peace. We see the building of massive networks of roads that permitted empire-wide transportation, communication. You think about this. Rome, to this day, there are Roman roads that were built in this time period we're talking about that are still in existence today. That's how well they were built. That's how well they were built. So these 400 years between the Old and New Testaments must have been important years. We look at what was necessary for the bringing in of the Messiah. The Old Testament and intertestamental period answered this question. Why did Jesus not come before the great flood? Well, why did Jesus not come before the great flood? And no need to. Come back to what Paul said in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. Those of us who live in the aftermath of Jesus' earthly ministry are indeed blessed, and we truly are. We're truly blessed. We're able to see that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He was the Messiah. We see the work of his ministry. We see the work of his miracles. We see the significance and the impact of his death. We look at our society and our culture today, and there's some who will say, look at what the world is coming to. However, we get to say to the world, look who has come to the world. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, left his home in glory. He came down to us. He came to this world, not to destroy it, but to seek and save that which was lost. We have to remember, we will be tested, but our test will be different from Abraham's test back in the Old Testament. We don't have to pack up and leave and go to a nation that we've never been to. Our test has to do with the question, what will you do with Jesus' earthly life? What will you do with Jesus, my friend? We thank you for joining us today for our second lesson in the study of the life of Christ. Look forward to continuing this study. May the Lord bless you and keep you as you study his word and strive to live in accordance with his will.